So to give a little bit of background and introduction, I was the Executive Vice President for the Association for Computing Machinery, the ACM, from 2018 to 2020. And one of the initiatives that I was very passionate about and involved in was to work with the Publications Board and a couple of the leads at ACM to think about names and naming in publications. So as part of that effort, I brought together a committee, an advisory board, a working group, and I am very, very pleased to say that Theresa Jean Tanenbaum, who is our speaker today, was one of the first people to join that effort and has been spearheading it ever since and really driving. We've got one sort of phase of the working group is done, and there has been a policy that has been released that is still being worked on. And there's another working group starting, and Theresa has agreed kindly to spend some time with the ACM and others, getting this policy, set of policies and the documents really refined. So today, we're going to learn a little bit more about Theresa's efforts there, and also sort of related efforts. And we've been chatting a bit and really think that while this was focused on publications and academic publishing, the lessons for us all in thinking about names and naming at a platform level really go way beyond that particular sphere. And so with that, I will hand over to Theresa, and so thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to Q&A later.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth. I'm really excited to get to present on this work. It kind of took over my life for the last 2 years in a way that this kind of work does, and I'm excited to have stuff to share from it. I've been doing a lot of work on inclusive identity practices in the academic publishing world. I'm going to talk about the background of the work that I've done there, and a little bit about the implications for Google and some of my own experiences with dealing with my identity management through Google. Let's see. But first, a little bit about me. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Informatics at UC Irvine. I run a multidisciplinary group where we create and evaluate experiences of what I call transformative play. And I'm by training and practice a storyteller. I use a combination of computational narrative techniques and theatrical production elements to create participatory narrative experiences. And these often combine digital and physical elements and usually involve role play or performance or other forms of structured enactment. And while much of my research is quite playful on the surface, it is also engaged at some level with some more serious questions of identity. Who do we get to be in the world? What identities are permitted or denied to us? How does it feel to take on another role or perspective? How do we design to facilitate perspective taking? And it is from this perspective that my interest in identity infrastructure and name change policies begins to fit into the bigger picture of my research. I tend to view equity and justice as design poetics for the work that I do. And while this has been implicit within all of my work, it's only been in the last 2 years that it has become a central and explicit focus of my scholarship, my activism, and my service. And this is because issues of equity, especially as they pertain to questions of identity, have taken on a personal urgency in my life since coming out as a transgender woman in 2019 and changing my name. This has led me to devote a significant amount of my life over the past 2 years to advocating for trans-inclusive name change policies within scholarly publishing. I've also been working with the Association of Computing Machinery and a group called Names for Life to help conceive of, build, and assess new inclusive identity infrastructures built around persistent identifiers. There are 2 big hurdles that I've faced when seeking to correct my name in previous work. The first is that not all publishers recognize the necessity and importance of making these changes in an accessible, comprehensive, private, timely, and sustainable way. The second is that publishers just haven't been prepared to make these changes from a practical standpoint. In the 2 years that I've been working on this problem, I've been fortunate enough to have been able to make significant progress on clearing this first hurdle. And the second one, we are starting to see some glimmers of how we might start to address the labor and the infrastructural challenges facing publishers in this space. In this talk, I'm going to be briefly reflecting on the personal circumstances that led to me taking on this work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my life. I'm going to discuss the work I've been doing with authors, publishers, and other stakeholders. And I'll go into a fair amount of nuts and bolts on how we've been doing this work, because I think it's important to model successful practices of advocating for institutional change around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And to close, I'm going to consider some of the implications for the future of how we think about digital identities, in particular, how we can think about this from Google's perspective, as I understand it. Choosing a new name as a trans person is both profoundly affirming and extremely intimidating. There's a lot to consider. Should it be easy to pronounce? Should it be easy to spell? Should it be easy to remember? Do I want a short name or a long name? Should it mean something special? I considered all of these things. I thought about search engine optimization. I thought about ease of writing and signing. And this is like picking your own name can be fraught. Like, how often do people get to pick their name? Usually it's picked for us. What was the name that I picked for myself going to say about me? And in the same way that my wife and I deliberated over our daughter's name in the months leading up to her birth, I found myself walking around with a list of names in my pocket that I was auditioning. Was I a Josie? Was I a Hannah? Did I take a family name? Do I take a name that is similar to my old masculine name so that I could make my transition more comfortable for the people around me? I really didn't want to have to make this decision on my own. And so I went to my mom and I said, what would you have called me if you'd known that I was a girl when I was born? But she hadn't picked out any girl names for me that she remembered. And so it was clear that I was going to have to do this myself. And this is a kind of privilege that you have when you transition that very few people experience. And one of the many aspects of the trans experience that I actually find really empowering and beautiful. And it's one that I took seriously. I didn't want to screw up the responsibility of selecting the right name for myself. My process of coming out was pretty haphazard. But the tipping point in my professional community was at the ACM Designing Interactive Systems Conference in June of 2019. At that point, I'd been slowly adopting a more gender non-conforming style and presentation, but hadn't really explained what was going on to anyone outside of a small circle of people who I trusted. I was just easing people in to the idea that I wasn't going to present in a masculine way. And at DIS, I took a leap that I'd been anxious about for months that was necessary. I left all of my masculine clothing at home and attended the conference en femme, except for my beard and my, at that point, unchanged name. I also took what felt like an enormous leap, and I asked for new pronouns, she, her, or they, them, prominently called out on stickers on my conference badge. I'd never dared ask for she, her pronouns before, and while I desperately wanted people to see and acknowledge this about me, I also felt like I was imposing on people around me, that I was asking them all to humor me in this idea. And this is how I found myself in a dress in the hotel lobby chatting with Elizabeth Churchill, who was at that point the executive vice president of the Association for Computing Machinery. And she says the ACM is trying to figure out how to handle author name changes, but we've been stuck on this for a little bit. Is this something that you're going to be interested in? And I allowed that I had been thinking about this, but I didn't yet know if or when I'd change my name. And she offered to add me to the conversation. I said, certainly, yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to be a part of that. That sounds great, not knowing what I was getting myself into. And my experience of being out at DIS showed me that I could be out and trans and visible in my professional world and not be ostracized and not be a pariah. And so even though I still felt a lot of imposter syndrome, even though I didn't feel like I had a right to call myself even trans, let alone a woman, I threw caution to the wind and I came out on July 4th of 2019. I call it my Independence Day. And by this time, I had the first piece of my name, Tess. My full legal name, Theresa Jean Tanenbaum, would come a few months later. Being called by my new name and pronouns was one of the most profound joys of my early transition. Tess Tanenbaum felt like a superhero's secret identity to me, or like the hero from a pulp detective story or a noir thriller. It was also a reference to my daughter's middle name, Tesla, which my wife and I had picked specifically because we thought that Tess Tanenbaum was such a great name. And after living for decades with a name that had made me feel wrong and invisible, having a name that felt like me was intoxicating. And it wasn't long before my relationship with my old name became somewhat fraught. The term that many trans people use to describe our previous names is dead name. I prefer necronym, but dead name is sort of the common usage one. And the longer I was out, the more accurate that word started to feel. And where I'd been relatively sanguine about my dead name at the beginning of my transition, it soon became a source of real trauma and pain for me. And as a relatively successful junior scholar, my dead name was everywhere in my professional life. It was a ghost of my former self that was rattling my chains, demanding to be given peace so it could finally rest. When you're an academic, your name becomes your brand and it surrounds you. It pervades your space. It's hard to avoid. And I knew that I'd be going up for tenure in a year, and this was a significant concern for me. The idea of my dead name being broadcast across my tenure materials made me physically ill. It could just make my skin crawl. I didn't want the tenure committee to be focused on my transness, such that they were unable to properly consider my professional accomplishments outside of it. And I also didn't want my bibliometrics to be impacted by the fact that I'd changed my name. So much so that I briefly considered taking a new name that shared initials with my previous first and middle names, in the hopes that I'd be able to ease the process of retaining credit for my previous publications. The idea of being dead named throughout my tenure case made me so uncomfortable that I set out to change my name on as many of my previously published works as possible. And at the time, I naively thought that publishers had pre-existing pathways for people to change their names. After all, many people, most often women, change their names at marriage or divorce. And so I was surprised to find that of the 15 venues where my work was published, not a single one of them had a formal policy or process for changing the name on a paper after publication. In fact, in 2019, when I started this work, there wasn't a single major publisher who explicitly permitted authors to change their names on previously published work. New name in hand, I reached out to the ACM. I sent Elizabeth a message and said, I want to start correcting my publications. And I was added to the working group that she was putting together. There were 3 other trans and non-binary colleagues in it, as well as members drawn from the ACM publication staff, the folks who oversee the sort of the day-to-day operations of the digital library, as well as members of the publications board who oversee matters of policy for the association. And so we were kind of a motley crew of folks in the community and staff within the organization. And in 2019, it was unprecedented for 4 relatively junior transgender scholars to find themselves with a seat at the table, helping to shape a policy that would impact a platform as large as the ACM Digital Library, especially a policy with no precedent within the publishing world. And the ACM, to their very great credit, had acknowledged that it might be possible to change the names of trans people on previous publications. We're going to give it a shot. However, it was clear to us that the people making decisions about the policy needed our perspective because the trans folks in the room understood the ongoing harms of the current status quo in a way that very few of the cis folks did. We understood that when a platform discloses the dead name of a trans person, especially in a way that juxtaposes it with their correct name, they also disclose the gender identity of that person. And this is no different than a platform revealing the sexuality or religious convictions of a person without their consent. For example, when I started changing my name on my published work, this was the best solution that Springer could offer me, a correction notice. And it's in many ways the worst of all worlds. Not only does this reveal my dead name, it also makes it impossible for even the most casual reader to ignore the fact that I'm trans. It's violating in the worst possible ways. And even as I was discovering how challenging it would be to create an inclusive policy at the ACM, I was also facing similar situations at all the other publishers where I was trying to change my name. And we countered these arguments again and again that there was this Orwellian slippery slope into sort of a thought crime space where people weren't allowed to think or speak certain names. And the problem was that even editors and publishers who were sympathetic to my requests saw correcting the record as humoring an author at best and violating the historical record at worst. This adherence to the notion of some sort of sacrosanct historical record ultimately fails to understand the myriad ways in which this record is a construct constituted by our ongoing collective negotiations around what is and isn't a meaningful contribution to the project of scholarship. The historical record of necessity is a curated archive. As a community, we agree that certain information merits preservation and other information doesn't. Scholars of archives recognize that the task of maintaining the information we've chosen to preserve is a dynamic and ongoing one, involving continuous transformation across different platforms and standards. The so-called historical record is a living thing that we all collectively tend to and nurture to advance the project of knowledge production and preservation. Insisting on the sanctity of some sort of static, idealized historical record misunderstands the very nature of such record and ignores the role that power plays in constructing it. And so I spent much of 2019 learning everything I could about the perspectives of publishers, the legal constraints they were working with, and the needs of trans people, especially trans people of color and trans people outside of North America and Europe who might want to change their names. And over the course of many long negotiations with the publishers of my work and long conversations with other trans people, I honed my knowledge and my arguments in favor of name change policies. The first and most critical piece of this argument was to properly frame the problem. Denying transgender authors the ability to change our names within the publication record is a form of discrimination that produces ongoing active harm. I set out to enumerate these harms in ways that I hoped the publishers I was negotiating with could understand. So these are the harms that the publishing world was causing by refusing to correct previous publications: violation of privacy, and I'll unpack these in a moment, denial of credit, denial of dignity, and ongoing corrective epistemic labor. So we're going to go through these one by one. The first is violation of privacy. Publishing an author's dead name exposes them to discrimination, harassment, and violence. As a transgender woman, I'm subjected to daily reminders that there are thousands of people in the world who don't want me to exist, at least not as myself. These people don't always go so far as to state out loud that they want to kill me, although plenty of them do, but they are very proud to campaign to eliminate my right to healthcare, employment protection, protection from housing discrimination, and my right to exist and occupy in public spaces. They want to erase people like me from the public sphere, to silence us, to hope that we'll go away. And the distressingly high suicide rate among trans people is a testament to the power of the anti-trans lobby's well-funded campaign of public disgust and hatred. And so for this reason, it's of critical importance that transgender people be able to exercise as much control as possible over the disclosure of our gender identity as a matter of personal safety. When a publisher discloses an author's dead name in a context where it is easily juxtaposed against our correct names, it is no different than if they had announced their sexuality, marital status, or religious affiliation. And as is often the case, this doesn't just announce the gender identity of the author, it also announces their location and contact information, as many publications include affiliations and mailing addresses for authors. And these concerns aren't abstract. Like, one of my close friends and colleagues, a non-binary trans woman, had a gun fired through the window of her house after her gender identity became the subject of discussion amongst her neighbors. And as frightening as this is, it is still quite benign when compared to what transgender academics face around the world. Not only are transgender people subjected to a greater threat of harassment and discrimination, but in many places it is law enforcement officials who are often the main perpetrators of this abuse and violence. And so you have nowhere to turn. The systems that are designed to protect people don't often protect us. The second major harm that publishers created by dead naming trans folks was denial of credit. Publishers endanger the career and safety of a trans author by forcing them to disclose their dead name and gender identity in order to receive credit for their work. Disclosing someone's transition through the use of their previous name not only endangers that person's life and livelihood, it also exposes them to implicit and explicit bias in terms of citations, tenure and promotion, and other aspects of their professional life. A trans scholar should be evaluated based on their scholarship, not on their gender identity. Allowing an incorrect name to persist within the scholarly record also incurs ongoing costs to a trans author by splitting their bibliometrics across two different online identities. This complicates citation counts, it makes H-index and I-10 scores more difficult to calculate, and it leads other scholars to continue to miscite the trans person in future publications. Additionally, the perpetuation of incorrect citations harms the author's metrics and use of tools such as Google Scholar, PubMed, ResearchGate, Crossref, DBLP, and others. The third harm is denial of dignity. Dead naming a trans person goes beyond simply making them uncomfortable. Last fall, I wrote about the experience of being dead named and misgendered. When it happens, I have a physical reaction, a reaction that is beyond my control. My vision narrows, vignettes, and I can't perceive anything in my periphery. My skin becomes clammy, my heart pounds, my throat closes up, my ears ring. I can't talk or think or even cry at first. I need to get out, to hide, to find a safe place to remind myself that I'm free. I'm not that person. I was never really that person. I use the word trauma with a capital T to describe the experience of being dead named or misgendered because it is a precise and accurate term to describe what happens to me when people slip. It is harmful to me, even if there is no harmful intent. these harms also intersect. The harms of this trauma response, coupled with the harms of inadvertent disclosure, can extend beyond the individual trans person. I've discussed how being dead named causes me to experience an involuntary trauma response. Consider now how it felt for me when an eager undergraduate student in one of my classes did some extra research for an assignment, located several uncorrected publications of mine online, cited them in a paper, and then shared this with the rest of the class on our message board. It's difficult to maintain your impartiality and professionalism when reviewing student work that is actively re-traumatizing you. And while I experienced the direct consequences of the student's discovery, they experienced the indirect consequences of traumatizing me, despite their having no ill intention towards me or even really understanding what they had done. And this takes me to my fourth harm, ongoing corrective epistemic labor. I think of the propagation of my dead name like the spread of a virus. This might be a little on the nose in our current historical moment, but here we are. Leaving a paper uncorrected for too long also creates more downstream labor for publishers and authors by increasing the number of transmission vectors for the damaging information. It's currently impossible to account for all of the digital copies of my scholarship that have been downloaded or entered into people's bibliographic management systems. That ship has sailed. Never mind paper copies. However, a timely correction can prevent new people from discovering and indexing a version of the paper with my dead name in it. And this is important because one of the biggest transmission vectors for dead names is the bibliographies of other people's publications, not in our own work. And as more publishers commit to removing dead names from their records, including in bibliographies and citing papers, the time and effort involved in making these corrections is only going to increase. Reducing the propagation of the dead name as early as possible can help reduce labor and expense down the road. And there are real pragmatic costs that arise from both refusing to correct an author's name or from gatekeeping access to name changes. The costs impact the author, but also their students, their colleagues, and the field at large. For the past 2 years, I've spent approximately a full workday every week on the process of self-advocacy around my name change. This is 3.5 months, or almost 2 full academic quarters of time and labor invested in this process. Despite taking all of this time, there are still countless places where my dead name persists online. I found a bunch while I was putting my slides together last night. The time I spend trying to correct my name on my scholarship is time when I'm not doing new research. It's time when I'm not preparing my classes or grading papers or advising my graduate students. It's time when I'm not doing other forms of service to my university or the field. And it's time that scholars who haven't changed their names don't have to spend. It's important to frame these harms within the broader burdens shouldered by marginalized persons, especially when it comes to the labor that we do in order to safely exist in the world. In 2016, Nora Bernstein coined the term epistemic exploitation to describe this phenomenon. Drawing on experiences recounted by Black women, she writes, "Epistemic exploitation occurs when privileged persons compel marginalized persons to educate them about the nature of their oppression. I argue that epistemic exploitation is marked by unrecognized, uncompensated, emotionally taxing, coerced epistemic labor. The coercive and exploitative aspects of the phenomenon are exemplified by the unpaid nature of the educational labor and its associated community costs. The double bind that marginalized persons must navigate when faced with the demand to educate, and the need for additional labor created by the default skepticism of the privileged." Bernstein cites Audre Lorde, who perfectly captures how this feels. "Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men. Lesbian and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual world. The oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their own actions. There is a constant drain of energy which might be better used in redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future." Most historically excluded and oppressed people experience epistemic exploitation throughout their lives, sometimes without even realizing it. When I shifted from a position of relative privilege to a position of significant vulnerability, I found myself expending effort educating my cisgender colleagues about the nature of my experiences just to be accorded some small measure of the safety, security, and privilege that they received by default. I was complaining about this to my colleague and collaborator, Kata Spiel, who pointed me towards Bernstein's paper. Reading it felt like being hit by a truck. By requiring oppressed people to shoulder the burden of educating people around them about the nature of their oppression, epistemic exploitation perpetuates that oppression. It puts the burden and responsibility for change on people who are already more vulnerable. It reduces their available resources to effect change, and it allows more privileged people to maintain their own ignorance of their complicity in upholding systems of oppression. Engaging in this kind of labor is made more difficult by the fact that the privileged people are often skeptical about the oppression that marginalized people experience. Bernstein writes, "The default skepticism of the privileged is itself an expression of privilege. People who do not face a specific type of oppression have the privilege of remaining ignorant about the ways that oppression exists and manifests. For example, non-disabled persons have the privilege of not knowing whether the buildings they work in are accessible. Cisgender people have the privilege of not knowing the locations of safe gender-neutral bathrooms. White scholars have the privilege of not knowing that meritocracy has never been a feature of academia, etc." Working on the ACM name change policy was an extended exercise in epistemic labor in the face of a default skepticism that required us to make the same arguments over and over. However, in September of 2019, the other trans people and I persuaded the working group to allow us to take the first stab at drafting the new name change policy. A shortened version was officially approved by the publications board in November of 2019. And although it was imperfect, especially in compromising how citing documents were treated, it still represented a radical step towards trans inclusivity in the publishing world, the first trans inclusive name change policy to be adopted by a major publisher. Since the approval of this policy, we have continued to advocate for the rest of the publishing world to adopt similar policies. The ACM policy was proof that it was possible to convince publishers that they needed to grant name changes. However, it became clear to me that we needed a conversation within the publishing world at large around this issue if we wanted to see widespread change. And so after months of emailing editors and publishers and generally making a nuisance of myself, I found myself in contact with a sympathetic editor at Springer Nature who offered me a platform to advance this conversation. So published in July of 2020, and using my experiences with the ACM policy as a case study, this article started a conversation in the academic publishing world that put me in conversation with many more people than I'd previously encountered. The Nature article led several transgender academics in different fields to reach out to me, sharing their own struggles and their own successes at getting their names changed. And so on July 22nd, 2020, on the same day that the Nature article was published, I started a working group and created a Discord server for us to compare notes and help each other navigate the process of trying to persuade publishers in our fields to start adopting policies of their own. This group would eventually grow to include over 50 scholars from diverse fields and backgrounds. And we found ourselves confronted with a significant problem of epistemic exploitation. We kept encountering the same objections and concerns when we sought to have our names changed. It was draining and counterproductive for each of us to individually refute these concerns. And so, our first major project was to write an article that laid out the stakes for trans scholars when publishers don't change our names, and unpack and debunk the common arguments we collectively encountered while seeking to correct this. By pooling our knowledge in this way, we were able to reduce the amount of epistemic labor we were each doing individually, and we were able to greatly shorten many of the preliminary negotiations with publishers. Just anytime somebody raised an objection, we just point them to the article where we had already rebutted it, because honestly, there was nothing we haven't heard at this point. My plan for starting a conversation in the academic publishing world was working. Members of my working group and I started to receive interview requests, and more publishers were starting to announce their own policies, and the word was spreading in academic circles. In September of 2020, a colleague of Irving Rettig, one of our founding members, invited us to join a COPE working group to try and develop formal guidance for the publishing world. COPE is a nonprofit organization that stands for the Committee of Publication Ethics that issues ethical guidance to thousands of publishers, associations, and journals worldwide, and helps to mediate disputes between publishers and authors. I realized that while a growing number of publishers were starting their own policy work, nobody had articulated the high-level principles for how these changes should be approached. With the blessing of the COPE working group, I drafted a document in collaboration with the NCPWG, our Name Change Policy Working Group, that collected the knowledge and experience we had accrued over the last year and outlined a vision for the future. The resulting article outlined 5 high-level principles for a more trans-inclusive publishing world. These include accessibility. Name changes should be available to authors upon request without legal documentation, unnecessary barriers, burdens, or labor placed upon the author making the request. Comprehensiveness. Name changes should remove all instances of an author's previous name from the records maintained and disseminated by the publisher. Invisibility. Name changes should not draw attention to the gender identity of an author, nor create a clear juxtaposition between the current name and the previous name. Expediency and simplicity. Name changes should be implemented in a timely manner and with a minimum of bureaucratic overhead. And recurrence and maintenance. Publishers should regularly audit and correct new instances of changed names in order to prevent ongoing dissemination of incorrect information. The release of these principles represented a tipping point in the global consensus around post-publication name changes. This took place in January of 2021. In the months following its release, many major publishers released new policies, including Wiley, Taylor and Francis, Sage, Elsevier, and most recently Springer. As of today, more than 2 years since I started working on this, there are 55 publishers and journals who have adopted trans-inclusive name change policies. We estimate that as a result of our efforts, there are now 12,220 journals where authors can update their names, and we anticipate more to join their ranks in the coming months. Our work has been national news, appearing on CNN and in the New York Times, and there was even a new article about the work we've been doing in Nature this July, almost 1 year exactly from when I published my first column. So over the last 2 years, we have made it very hard for publishers to ignore the need to accommodate post-publication name changes. And we've been making headway on solving the practical and infrastructural challenges that accompany these requests. The publishing world has served as a case study for more inclusive identity practices, and we're now reaching beyond academic publishing to start advocating for these practices to be integrated into the digital infrastructures that shape everyone's lives, just what brings me here today. So I've learned the hard way that correcting my work at the point of publication doesn't stop dead-named versions of it from circulating. So long as those versions remain in circulation, platforms like Google Scholar will continue to dead-name me and continue to misattribute my work. The nature of Scholar's algorithm, insofar as it can be reverse engineered from the outside, relies upon a consensus from the different sites that it has indexed to determine authorship. Thus, even though this chapter of mine was corrected by the publisher over 2 years ago, and even though the search engine has indeed located a corrected version on the ACM Digital Library, the presence of loose PDFs of the publication on sites like academia.edu and ResearchGate has convinced the engine to attribute the paper to my dead name. And so before I continue, I want to ask a few critical questions, just some things to keep in mind as we move forward. First, do the software systems that you design, maintain, and administer support users who change their names? What does a user have to do to update or correct their name in the system if it is supported? What are the costs to the user if a name change is not supported? What are the costs to the system operators if a name change is not supported? And to what extent is your system built on an assumption of an unchanging name? I'm going to come back to some of these in a bit and unpack them. But up until this point, I've been using the case of transgender name changes to help contextualize why our working group has been advocating for specific aspects of these policies. However, our success in the publishing world hasn't come because it's a new phenomenon for people to change their names. The vulnerability of trans people has simply given us a perspective on the necessity of these kinds of accommodations that other folks may lack. As more publishers adopt inclusive identity policies, the number of name change requests that publishers must accommodate is only going to increase over time. I expect that as the possibility of name changes becomes more widespread and more commonly known, that eventually trans people will be in the minority of people seeking name changes to previous publications. And this is because many of us change our names over the course of our lives due to marriage, divorce, religious conversion, or even just for purely aesthetic personal reasons. Central to the guidance that we've been developing with COPE is the idea that these name changes must be inclusive and available to anyone, regardless of their reason for changing their name. This is a reality that is not often reflected in our software platforms. And perhaps it made sense for digital names to be unchangeable in the early days of computing. Perhaps it made sense when we were building systems that were grounded in the logics of an analog or a print world. Perhaps it made sense when our civic institutions relied primarily upon names to track and regulate their populations. Perhaps it makes sense to treat names as unchangeable if your assumptions about name stability are grounded in the experiences of men who change their names less often than women in our society. But none of this actually makes sense today. In a world where names are indexed by computational systems, it is absurd that we still rely upon names as the primary identifier for any digital given record. Facilitating name changes in our platforms is an equity issue that extends far beyond the need to protect transgender people's privacy. Since beginning this work, I've had many women approach me with stories about having aspects of their lives complicated by their decision to publish under a particular name when they were younger. One friend, who first published under her maiden name, chose to retain it when she married. She told me how she was initially viewed with suspicion when picking up her children at school because she didn't share their last name. Another woman shared with me that she had just stopped reporting several of her earliest publications on her CV because they were published under the surname of an abusive ex-husband, and she couldn't bear to see that name anymore. Many women struggle with the decision to change their name at marriage or divorce, knowing that keeping their old name will have social consequences, but that adopting a new name will have professional ones. This highlights the ways in which the existing assumptions about identity that have been encoded within our platforms and infrastructures serve to establish and maintain specific, often gendered power structures. Put very bluntly, the reason this problem exists is because our systems are designed to accommodate the needs of a patriarchal, neo-feudal capitalist society. In our world, historically, the privilege of having a fixed name throughout one's life has been reserved for land-owning, white, straight, cisgender men. Such men were empowered to mark their property with the brand of their family, their surname. Our software platforms were built with this in mind. They need to change. Marie Draz discusses these infrastructures in terms of externalized memory and considers how the rigid encoding of gendered information within our systems of documentation serves to exert control over people who might transgress against the normative social order. Writing about the consequences of a mismatch between one's lived gender and one's identity documents, she writes, "While for many people such documents are barely noticeable, the memory is sufficiently punishing for others. Regardless of how someone is living or how others affirm their lived gender, the past assignment preserved at this level can resist forgetting. The documentation too easily serves as a reminder. This memory, in turn, is used to either support or contradict the present. For those who are privileged by current arrangements, for whom the memory is more or less correct, these systems of classification don't feel punishing. But for those who experience this disconnect between lived and documented gender, the reminder of the document and the persistence of a past assignment preserved therein can certainly burn." The work of correcting the names within a platform or system to affirm people's current identities is a form of what Draz would call resistant forgetting. Forgetting is not endorsed here as an abstract good. To the contrary, it is a specific tool wielded against an overdetermined and overdetermining past. Resistant forgetting, therefore, involves thinking differently, not only about how and why we participate in mundane, everyday acts of identity documentation, but also about the kinds of punishments with which this memory making is intertwined. Creating space for people to update their previous work returns agency and autonomy to individuals over their identity. A necessary next step is to rethink how our systems, platforms, and infrastructures might be improved so that they no longer serve the needs of some abstract normative order, but instead serve the needs of the community of living people whose lives they impact. And so, returning to this list of questions I'd asked, I'd like to pull out questions 3 and 4 as being especially salient. What are the costs to the user if a name change is not supported? Let's take the Google account as an example. We're at Google. We can see here that this name cannot be changed. And you can see here that my email, like many people's, uses my first and my last name. So what does this mean for a user who changes their name and would like to no longer be associated with the name on that email address? Well, you do what I did. You create a new account. And when you do that, what is lost for the user who must create a new account? What does that impact for them? Well, here's a quick and incomplete accounting of some of the value that accrues to a user's account over time. Some of this is monetary, purchases and subscriptions that can't be transferred to a new name. Other items on this list represent investments of time and labor, creating albums and mail filters, setting up calendars. Even for those items that can be transferred or saved via Google Takeout, the user must invest significant time should they wish to retain access to services and data. This is a hefty price to pay to avoid your dead name. It's one that I've been paying very meticulously and painstakingly over the last 26 months as I continue to discover things that were attached to my dead name Gmail account. It's a form of discrimination. It places a burden on people who change their names that is not shared by people who do not. And when I changed my email address, it didn't just cost me. It also cost Google. You are all much more qualified than I am to determine the loss in value when a 12-year-old account is deactivated and a brand new account is created. But all of the data and metrics that Google collected about me, all of the value that Google derived from the more than a decade of personal demographic information that I'd fed into the algorithm, that's all gone. But I haven't deleted that account because I can't afford to replace the information in it. It continues to be active, if mostly idle and gathering dust. That means that it's taking up space, consuming resources, that much of its material is redundant, duplicated into my new account as I slowly migrate things over, but still left behind on the old one. And so the question I want to ask is the cost of denying users the ability to change their name worth the benefit that Google derives from keeping Google accounts static? Or perhaps a more salient question, why is the primary identifier for a Google account the user's email address, something that is very liable to change over the course of their lifetime, and not a more stable unit of data that isn't as implicated in the lived reality and social reality of the user? Our software systems don't privilege all people's experiences equally. Each design choice about what data to collect, how to categorize it, how to preserve it, and what aspects to treat as immutable or unchangeable is in some way an assertion of power. As a community of people who are invested in the project of building and maintaining platforms that can potentially operate as systems of externalized memory, you have the power to consider whether your designs serve to reproduce existing hierarchies and systems of oppression, or whether they return power and agency to vulnerable people. We started to explore the consequences and possibilities of new identity infrastructures within the publishing world, but in the long run, I believe that this same approach needs to be extended to every platform and system that maintains any kind of identity records. I argue that if we're going to live with systems and platforms that exert a kind of gravity over our identities, we should build those systems to serve the needs of the most vulnerable of us, because doing so will empower all of us in the long run. Thank you for your time. We have some time for questions. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with y'all.